In the history of the American Republic, names come and go, but one name is carved so deeply into the bedrock of the nation that it has become synonymous with the office of the presidency itself. To the world, they were the architects of the Square Deal and the New Deal. To the elite of New York, they were something more ancient, the Knickerbockers. This is the story of a family that didn't just witness American history, they willed it into existence. From the muddy streets of New Amsterdam to the halls of the White House, the Roosevelts maintained a standard of wealth that was never flashy, yet always felt infinite. It was wealth rooted in land, in trade, and in a fierce sense of noblesse oblige, the idea that with great power comes a moral debt to the public. But the Roosevelt story is also a story of a house divided. Two branches, two philosophies, and two distinct visions of what it meant to be an American aristocrat. This is the Roosevelt family, politics, power, and the secret history of old money.
To understand the Roosevelts, you must look back further than the Vanderbilts or the Rockefellers. Before the British took New York, it was New Amsterdam. In 1644, a man named Klaas Martensen van Roosevelt arrived from the Netherlands. He was a simple farmer, but he was land-hungry. Klaas purchased a farm that occupied much of what is now Midtown Manhattan, including the area where the Empire State Building stands today. This was the old money secret. They bought the land when it was dirt and held it while it became gold. For a century, the Roosevelts were merchants, sugar refiners, and real estate moguls. They weren't just wealthy, they were part of the landed gentry, a class of Dutch families who formed the social backbone of New York. By the mid-18th century, the family tree split into two paths that would define the next 200 years of American politics. The first branch was the Oyster Bay Roosevelts. They were the city dwellers who moved to the North Shore of Long Island. They were traditionally Republican, rugged, and business-minded. This line would produce the 26th President Theodore Roosevelt. The second branch was the Hyde Park Roosevelts. They moved north to the Hudson Valley, living the life of country squires. They were the Democrats, gentlemen farmers who valued the slow pace of the river over the frantic energy of the city. This line would produce the 32nd President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Every great Roosevelt leader looked back to one man as their moral compass, Theodore Roosevelt Sr. In the mid-1800s, he was one of the wealthiest men in New York, but he was famous for his heart. He helped found the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the American Museum of Natural History, and the Children's Aid Society. He taught his children that wealth was a responsibility. His son, the future president, Theodore Roosevelt, was a sickly boy, asthmatic and frail. His father told him, "Theodore, you have the mind, but you have not the body. You must make your body." This strenuous life philosophy became the Roosevelt trademark. They didn't just sit in clubs, they climbed mountains, fought wars, and challenged the status quo. How did they stay so wealthy for so long? Unlike families that bet on one single industry, the Roosevelts were diversified. In the early 1800s, James Roosevelt, FDR's great-grandfather, was a titan in the sugar refining business. At the time, sugar was the white gold of the world economy. They also moved into banking and the fledgling railroad industry, but they were conservative. While the robber barons like Jay Gould were taking massive risks and destroying reputations, the Roosevelts focused on safe money, government bonds, prime real estate, and banking. This allowed them to survive every financial panic of the 19th century with their lifestyle intact. They lived by the old money code. You never spend your principal, only your interest. You never show off your wealth to those who have less, and you always put the family name first.
In February 1884, Theodore Roosevelt was a rising star in the New York State Assembly. He was 25 years old, wealthy, and deeply in love with his young wife, Alice. He believed his path was set. But within the span of a single afternoon, the old money bubble of security was shattered. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, Theodore's mother died of typhoid fever in the family's Manhattan home. Only 11 hours later, in the same house, his wife, Alice, died of kidney failure just 2 days after giving birth to their first daughter. The double tragedy nearly broke him. He refused to ever speak his wife's name again. He left his infant daughter in the care of his sister and fled New York. He didn't go to Europe or Newport. He went to the Badlands of the Dakota Territory to become a ranchman. It was here, among the cattle and the outlaws, that the Harvard dandy died and the Rough Rider was born. When Theodore returned to New York 2 years later, he was a different kind of Roosevelt. He had lost a fortune in the cattle business, over $80,000, but he had gained a grit that the Manhattan elite couldn't understand. He rejoined the political fray, not as a typical old-money socialite, but as a reformer. As police commissioner of New York, he spent his nights walking the beat in disguise, catching corrupt officers in the act. His own class began to view him with suspicion. To the wealthy Knickerbockers, Theodore was becoming a traitor to his class. In 1901, after the assassination of William McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt became the youngest president in American history. The industrial titans of Wall Street, men like J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller, assumed that because Theodore was one of them, he would protect their interests. They were wrong. Theodore viewed the massive monopolies, or trusts, as a threat to the very soul of the republic. He famously took on J.P. Morgan's Northern Securities Railroad Trust, taking the fight all the way to the Supreme Court. When Morgan asked if they could fix the problem privately, Theodore replied that the law was not a business deal. He intervened in the 1902 coal strike, siding with the miners over the owners, a move that was unheard of for a president. He was creating a square deal for every American. The message was clear. The Roosevelts might be old money, but their first loyalty was to the flag, not the bank. While Theodore was shaking the foundations of the global economy, his home life remained centered at Sagamore Hill. This was the sanctum of the Oyster Bay branch. It was a house filled with children, dogs, and the heads of African lions. It represented the rugged side of the family wealth. They weren't interested in French tapestries. They were interested in the natural world. This passion for the wilderness led Theodore to protect over 230 million acres of American land. He didn't just save the land, he saved the American character from being swallowed by industrial greed. But as the Oyster Bay branch reached its peak, a young cousin from the Hyde Park branch was watching from the sidelines, a young man named Franklin, who was about to marry Theodore's favorite niece, Eleanor.
While Theodore Roosevelt was out west killing his dandyism in the Badlands, a different kind of Roosevelt was being raised 80 miles north of Manhattan. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was born in 1882 at Springwood, the family's estate in Hyde Park. Franklin was the Prince of the Hudson. Unlike the Oyster Bay Roosevelts, who were known for their ruggedness, the Hyde Park branch, led by Franklin's father, James, and his formidable mother, Sarah Delano, lived the life of European aristocrats. Franklin was an only child, the center of his mother's universe. He was tutored at home, traveled to European spas, and was taught that his primary job was to be a gentleman. In Hyde Park, wealth wasn't about the hustle of the city, it was about stewardship. The Roosevelts were the patrons of the local church and the leaders of the local farmers. This environment gave Franklin a natural, easy confidence, the Roosevelt smile, that would later convince a desperate nation that they had nothing to fear but fear itself. If Franklin was the Prince of Hyde Park, his cousin Eleanor was the orphan of Oyster Bay.
The favorite niece of President Theodore Roosevelt, Eleanor's childhood was a Gothic tragedy. Her mother, a legendary beauty, called her Granny because she was plain. Her father, Theodore's brother, Eliot, was a charming but destructive alcoholic who died when she was only 10. Eleanor was sent away to school in England, where she finally found her voice under the mentorship of Marie Souvestre. She returned to New York not as a debutante, but as a young woman with a radical conscience. While her peers were shopping at Tiffany's, Eleanor was volunteering in the slums of the Lower East Side. On March 17, 1905, the two branches of the Roosevelt family merged in the wedding of the century. It was a cold, rainy St. Patrick's Day in Manhattan. Because Eleanor's father was dead, her uncle, President Theodore Roosevelt, gave the bride away. The president was the most famous man on earth. He walked Eleanor down the aisle and, in typical TR fashion, joked with the guests, effectively overshadowing the groom. When the ceremony was over, the guests swarmed the president, leaving the newlyweds standing alone. Theodore famously told Franklin, "It's a good thing to keep the name in the family."
But there was a third person in the marriage, Franklin's mother, Sarah. She didn't want to lose her boy. She bought the couple a townhouse in Manhattan, right next door to her own, and had the walls connected so she could walk into their home at any hour. Sarah represented the most rigid form of old money control. She held the purse strings. She didn't approve of Eleanor's progressive friends or her interest in the poor. For the first 10 years of the marriage, Eleanor felt like a guest in her own life, a woman trapped between the dominant shadow of her Uncle Theodore and the suffocating control of her mother-in-law. Franklin was obsessed with his cousin Theodore's career path. He followed it like a blueprint: New York State Senate, then Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Even though Franklin was a Democrat and Theodore was a Republican, Franklin was essentially playing the character of a Roosevelt leader. He was a man of the sea, a yachtsman who loved the power of the fleet. He was the new face of the family, the Hyde Park version of TR's Big Stick. But just as he was preparing for a run for the vice presidency in 1920, the Roosevelt invincibility was about to be tested by a force that no amount of money could buy off. In August 1921, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was enjoying the summer at Campobello Island, his family retreat in New Brunswick, Canada. He was 39 years old, tanned, athletic, and on the verge of claiming the Democratic Party's nomination for president. Suddenly, a severe fever struck. Excruciating pain shot through his back and legs. Within days, his strong, athletic body was paralyzed from the waist down. The diagnosis was devastating: polio. It was a death sentence for a political career and a life sentence to a wheelchair. His mother, Sarah, wanted him to retire from public life, to live out his days as a revered Hyde Park squire. It was the old money way: retreat and protect the image. But Franklin, despite his initial despair, refused to surrender. He began a grueling, painful regime of therapy, determined to walk again. Polio transformed not only Franklin, but his marriage. For years, Eleanor had felt stifled, often retreating from her husband's social circle. But now, she became his legs, his eyes, and his voice. She traveled across the country, attending political meetings, giving speeches, and keeping Franklin's name alive. She was his legs and his eyes, but she also became her own woman. This was her political awakening. She transcended the role of the First Lady-in-Waiting to become a political force in her own right. Her strength was not just physical. The discovery of Franklin's affair with Lucy Mercer in 1918 had nearly destroyed their marriage. But the common enemy of polio and the shared ambition for his political future created a new, complex partnership, one based not on romance, but on an unbreakable shared purpose.
In 1924, Franklin discovered Warm Springs, Georgia. The warm, mineral-rich waters offered therapeutic relief for his paralyzed legs. He invested a significant portion of his personal old money fortune, over $200,000, to buy the decaying resort. He transformed it into a rehabilitation center, not just for himself, but for anyone suffering from polio. He didn't just donate money, he dedicated his life to it. He insisted that no one be turned away for lack of funds. This was the embodiment of noblesse oblige, the idea that immense wealth carried a duty to serve. Warm Springs became a haven, a place where the powerful and the poor swam side by side, united by their struggle. It was here, away from the prying eyes of the press, that Franklin learned the resilience of the common American. This experience would become the foundation of his New Deal philosophy. As the Great Depression plunged America into despair, the country cried out for a leader. In 1928, Franklin, still unable to walk unassisted, ran for governor of New York. Against all odds, he won. The press, often complicit in hiding his disability, rarely showed him in a wheelchair. The American public saw a strong, smiling man exuding confidence. The old money political machine of New York was fully behind him. In 1932, at the height of the Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt accepted the Democratic nomination for president. He flew to the convention, breaking tradition, and delivered a speech promising a new deal for the American people. The nation, desperate for hope, listened. The Prince of Hyde Park, refined by tragedy and supported by a political partner forged in fire, was about to lead America through its darkest hour.